Hello and welcome to
Fascinatingly Odd,
Fantastically Queer, a podcast by
JK.
and Darren.
Today we're in a Pret in Soho. I wasn't going to say the chain, but then I was hoping for some product placement at some point.
Yes. Well, in Soho off Old Compton Street.
Who are we meeting?
We are meeting Rhammel Afflick. I hope it's okay if I'm saying his last name.
Dear listener, he's sat next to us.
He nodded, it's fine.
And Rhammel is formidable, he's an activist, he spends tons of time doing stuff for LGBT causes.
I think he's someone within the LGBT community, especially in the UK, who's very outspoken. And I mean, if you're someone who's connected and just pays attention to LGBT issues, someone you probably would have heard of, who's always got something educational and something worth listening to say.
And I swear he's always on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, he's verified, so you have to be spend half your life on Twitter if you're verified. It's just, that's how you get a blue tick.
Was that not a thing pre-2009 you had to be verified by? Because I can't get verified anymore. So we asked Rhammel where he wanted to meet us. He said just off Old Compton Street. It's the gay district in the centre of London, which I'm sure most of you will know.
Anyway, should we just start the conversation?
Let's go for that.
Hi, Rhammel.
Hey.
So, why did you choose Old Compton Street?
Why Old Compton Street? I think probably like a number of LGBT people, Old Compton Street for me was the first experience I had of being part of the community in some way, namely through drinking, which I'm sure most people can relate to too. But yeah, for me, my first experiences within the community were, for a number of reasons, were Old Compton Street.
And so on Old Compton Street, where was that first place that you went?
The first place I ever went on Compton Street was GAY. The reason essentially we ended up in GAY was just because it was quite obviously an LGBT space. Had never been out in the area, didn't really know anything about the community at that point, and so off we went.
And how many years ago was that?
Well, we're talking 8 years ago now, maybe.
And then since then, you've obviously thrown yourself into LGBT causes, activism through your work, your work through the British Youth Council, through your policing.
Mm-hmm.
How do you have so much time?
The answer to me is easy. It's just passion, really. If you're passionate about things, then you make time for it. And all of the things that I've done over the last few years have all been things that I'm passionate about. And also, I'm slightly angry about things as well. And I think as long as you channel anger in the right places and do the right things with it, you can achieve something positive. So for me, that was where, the reason I find the time to do things.
And leading on that, what things are you angry about then?
Oh, where to start? There's so many things to be angry about. I mean, I think the way that the world treats LGBT people. But interestingly, one of the first things I ever wrote about for the Huffington Post was bisexuality, because one of the things that I experienced quite early on in my experiences within the LGBT community was just biphobia and this idea that bi people can't possibly exist. And I must admit I was quite shocked. I didn't expect to find that in the community. It came as a shock, but it quickly wasn't shocking when I realised actually how widespread it was. So certainly biphobia, definitely racism, and more recently, I think transphobia. Not because transphobia wasn't prevalent then, but I feel certainly in the last 4 or 5 years it's something that's far more on my radar than it ever was when I first sort of started going out and socialising in the LGBT community.
So, you touched upon racism in the community then. Something that we spoke about in last week in our episode was the whole flag in Manchester's adoption of the flag with the brown and black stripes. Opinions?
I mean, for me, it's really sad that it's such a contentious issue. For me, it shouldn't be a contentious issue, and it's sad. It just saddens me that actually people are having to defend that decision. Manchester Pride are making a conscious effort to make a point and stand in solidarity with people of colour within our community. I think the rhetoric that some people have used in response has been awful and just unnecessary. And one of the things that I find extraordinary is this idea that the flag is about replacing the pride flag. It isn't really about replacing anything. All it is about making a specific point. And in this context, I don't mean the flag itself, but within this context, what Manchester Pride is doing is a gesture. It's not actually. It doesn't change things in the in a material sense. It's actually a symbol of something, and it's about saying, actually, this is what we stand for.
So on that, the other alternative, which is including the black and brown stripes with the trans stripes. Now, obviously, as soon as you open something out, I'm going to be that gay white cis that says, where does it stop? How we identify and how we choose to show our sexuality and our identity is really, really important. And I'm completely in agreement with you, but how should we go forward from this to make sure that our communities are all feeling included? Does something like the rainbow flag become almost toxic?
I don't. I think by the very nature of the fact that it's an addition, the colours that we're talking about are in addition to the pride flag. It isn't saying that the pride flag in itself is toxic per se. Although some people just don't identify with that flag, they don't feel it represents them. And so I don't think it does that. In terms of where does it stop, I think actually, why does it have to stop? If we have to continue to make changes to ensure our community is more inclusive of the people that should be included from the in the first place, I'm all behind it. If we end up with a flag that has 30 different colours on it, couldn't care less. If that's what our community demands in that space or time, then I think that's where we should go. And it's quite evident, specifically the trans community in the last year or so, that those communities really do need that visibility. And I've always spoken about how important it is to couple that visibility with an actual platform for those communities to speak out. But visibility is a start. And for me, that trumps this idea that we're diluting something before. We're not really diluting anything. All we're saying is that these people in this specific time deserve our attention, and in response also they deserve action as well. And so for me, that's far more important than this idea we might be diluting. I don't think we are. We're adding something on and saying, actually, this is something we need to focus on. This is something we need to be conscious of, far more than we ever have been.
Yeah, I think it's highlighting the fact that there's issues that needs to be addressed, a topic that needs to be addressed, and it's not saying what has happened needs to be ignored. It's just being look, these are things that we need to kind of almost focus on a little bit, or like you're saying, draw attention to. Which, where does it stop? It doesn't need to stop. Transphobia, racism is a big topic at the moment, but then there's always you were talking about bi-erasure and biphobia, then there's intersex people and things like that. There's always going to be something else that comes along. Is that a bad thing? No, it just means we're being more and more inclusive and more aware of the different minorities within the minority.
But as a community, the symbols that we choose to rally behind are really important. So would it not be more powerful, perhaps, and I'm going completely out of the blue on this, but for Manchester Pride to, instead of adopt, well, I suppose they have in this example, but for other places to perhaps adopt the trans flag for their official Pride flag this year as a status, as a symbol of unity, solidarity, inclusivity?
I don't think there's a simple answer to the way forward. I think for me, what's really important is that LGBT organisations are, making it clear that they're not going to stand for certain things happening, and that includes transphobia and racism, but a whole host of other things as well. And for me, the symbols that we decide or choose to rally behind aren't hugely important, but as long as we are demonstrating in some way that actually this is what we stand for, and then taking action. It's all good we have these symbols, and symbols can be really powerful, but actually if it's detached from what's actually happening on the ground, then it becomes worthless. And as I say, it's important that it isn't just a gesture, that it's coupled with all this other stuff that needs to happen, where people actually confront these issues on a day-to-day basis, not just when they're talking on a podcast or when they're in a media interview or when they're on a panel, but actually in their day-to-day lives. What have you done to challenge the way that other people are thinking or acting, or what have you done to challenge yourself? What have you done to challenge your own actions? And for me, that is far more important.
And I suppose that's the interesting point, isn't it? We live in an age where everyone has access to information really quickly, and actually the people that are pissed off with this are the people that should need to inherently perhaps question this in their own lives anyway. Not necessarily to say that they're wrong, but to understand where they are in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's one of the things that is missing from modern day activism at the moment is the importance of reflecting on your own actions. I think there's this idea that activism is all about changing everyone else around you. When actually I think the most powerful piece of activism is how you change yourself, because your own actions in themselves inform other people. I think the most powerful thing you can do is show how much you mean what you say. And I think it sounds really fluffy, but I just think that's the basis of it. It's not talked about enough. It's kind of, I think it's very easy to cancel people. It's very easy to shout at other people and say they're getting it wrong. Actually, what are you doing, really, other than maybe shouting?
And that act is as simple as correcting someone when they refer to someone with the wrong pronouns, or if someone you see on online dating has their profile which says no femmes, no Asians, no whatever, holding the people that we're closest to account.
I think it's also understanding your own biases and understanding your own privileges, which I think a lot of people don't want to accept that they've got.
Absolutely, but I think that again, it's this lack of understanding of what privilege is, in the sense that I think it's so multi-layered. I consider myself to be very privileged. I know that the things that I've had access to from a very young age have put me in the position I am today. No doubt about it. There's no doubt in any way. The reason I started writing for the HuffPost all those years ago, it must be 8 years ago, was pretty much maybe months after I came out. The reason I had access to those things was because of the things that I'd already done. Yes, some of those, it's about my hard work and graft, but at the end of the day, if I couldn't acknowledge the privileges that have brought me where I am today, then how on earth can I lecture anyone else on their own privileges? And I think that's one of the things that really irritates me, is this idea that because you've experienced hardship, you don't have any privilege. That's just not true. Actually, it's multi-layered, and you may have more privilege than other people. And then there are some people, maybe if you're white, cis, male, you might have more privilege than most people. But it isn't as easy as just saying this person has privilege and this person has no privilege. I think most people are afforded some kind of privilege. And it's actually how do you acknowledge that, and how is that relative to the people that are around you? That for me is important.
And how should people do that? That's a really self-reflecting question. Is there a right way of?
I don't think it's. I think it's acknowledging that understanding your privilege is a journey. You don't wake up one day and understand it all. That would be ridiculous to say. It'd be ridiculous to even to say that I understand all of my own privileges and how I've got to where I am. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that you're constantly reflecting and understanding where your position in things, and that for me is, the important part is actually, you don't suddenly wake up and be an expert on your own, where your own position. I think it's just something you're constantly analysing, and also your privilege can change over time. Where I am now and where I was 8 years ago, I have far more privilege than I did then, because I have access to certain things, or access to resource, or access to finance, whatever it is. I know I'm not in that same position, and so and once you understand privilege as something that moves, almost like a conveyor belt, if you like, then you might be at ease with accepting that you've got some.
I think this takes me back, talking about privileges with you, takes me back to that interview I did with you last year for one of my projects I was working on. And I've turned around and I've said this to a lot of other people, when you turn around and said you could stand and talk for trans people, but the better thing to do would be let them use your platform, give up that kind of privilege to let them also adopt it for that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that made me chuckle slightly that I saw on Twitter was someone suggesting that they were tired of seeing, black people, specifically in this context, go to events and say that they were the only black people at that person at that event. And it's sort of like, actually, what did you do to change that? Could you have brought someone along? All of that kind of stuff. And for me, that's a higher level, that I think some people have reached. They understand that actually, in order to change things, it's also about your own actions as well. And so for me, yeah, absolutely. If you've been afforded some kind of privilege, how can you support other communities who are less privileged, or just other people within your own community? You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a different one. Actually, even within your own community, you might be afforded more privilege than others, and so that might mean giving up a space, or it might mean, you know, not going to something, or it might mean you know, someone calling you and saying, actually, I want to do an interview with you about this specific topic, and say, actually, I'm not the best person to speak to on this topic, but here's someone who could. I mean, if you happen to know someone, if you don't, fine. But it's more importantly giving up that space and saying, actually, I don't need to occupy this space.
Do you think that's a practical approach, though? Do you think people are willing to do that, or do you think, you know, it's just something that, like, it needs to be addressed?
It has to be addressed, but then at the same time, I think one of the things that has been interesting about this conversation so far is we've almost talked about it as if people aren't also actively making a choice to occupy those spaces. AKA, they understand their privilege, they understand the fact that they're occupying those spaces and they don't always need to, and they're choosing to stay in those spaces. And, you know, one of the things that I think can be frustrating is this idea that it's all unconscious. You know, it's all about this idea that, oh, you didn't know, or this idea that you're just ignorant. Actually, some people do know. They're educated enough. They have an understanding. They've listened to how many people of colour or trans people speak out about these issues, and they've still actively chosen to do whatever it is that they're doing. And that, for me, is something that needs to be challenged. You know, because there are people who are, you know, who are holding on to those spaces because they know that in order for equality to move forward, some people have to give up space, and some people know that, and they don't want to, because they know that actually, you know, they enjoy the status that they have at the moment, and they don't want to admit that actually, in order for us to move forward, that might mean them having less privilege. And that, for me, is angering. But I think that the community is becoming more and more critical of itself, and I think that some of those people won't be able to hold on to that privilege forever, as long as the community, you know, moves in the same way it is at the moment.
In a way, I think for me, one of the most important things is to realise that we're all still fighting for the same cause. And I think it develops on that point of people having to step down and realise that actually it's time to champion something else, and maybe the platform that they've got needs to air other voices. But ultimately we need to be fighting for everyone within our community, and so I suppose if they're not willing to do that, at least be showing, you know, putting your head on the line and fighting for these different underrepresented communities, some of the bigger issues that we face today. Yeah. And I wonder whether any of them are doing that to a point.
Yeah, but I think that one of the things you have to remember is that I think there are different ways of fighting for communities. You know, I think people, you know, you don't have to always be at the front. Sometimes you can actually stand at the back and support. Sometimes it's, you know, sometimes it's not sending a whole new tweet with your take. It's just retweeting somebody else. Well, that's probably the easiest way I can sort of explain it. You know, and quite often I see that. Sometimes I see people putting out a take, and I'm like, okay, I'm glad that you have some sort of emotional response to this situation, but actually, you know, is your opinion always needed? Not necessarily. Sometimes it's just sharing someone else's, and I think realizing that that's part of it, and that, you know, you just don't always have to have your say. Sometimes it's just not your place, and there will be situations absolutely where you should speak up and on behalf of, because you're forced to and there's no other option. But that shouldn't be the first thought. That should be a last resort. And for so many people, for a lot of people, it isn't a last resort. It's their first thought. They need to speak on behalf of. Not really, actually. Quite a lot of people can and will, given the opportunity, speak for themselves.
And that's the key point, isn't it? It's the opportunity.
Opportunity is a huge part of it. You know, there are the amount of people. One of the extraordinary things about being involved in Pride in London has been the opportunity to meet so many people who are articulate and have so much to say, but they're just not given that opportunity, and that's quite frustrating. Knowing that it's not that the talent isn't there, or it's not that people don't necessarily want the opportunity. It's that they just haven't got access to it. That makes me angry, and it's something that we should never, that should never happen, but it's still happening.
So I want to go back to that first moment that you came to Soho. So obviously we spoke about GAY and you came because of that, but can you remember that time?
I remember it. I mean, despite it being alcohol fueled, I do remember it. But I remember my initial sort of maybe 3 or 4 times going to LGBT venues. I was quite naive, For some unknown reason, I imagined that the LGBT community would be far more progressive in so many ways. And I hadn't appreciated that the structures that I'd acknowledged in mainstream British communities were always going to be present within the LGBT community. But for whatever reason, I came in not thinking about that and came in just wanting to have a drink. I mean, that's all it was, really. I wanted to have a drink, wanted to be amongst friends, and wanted to be amongst people who got me. But also looking for companionship and and an opportunity to do something different. One of the things that is really sad about that is it very quickly was obvious that as a black person specifically, the outsider in so many ways. One of the things that I think was so prevalent back then that I don't hear so much in sort of social settings now, but maybe because of the people I choose to hang around with. But there was a constant obsession with, sexualizing black men in those situations, specifically, dick size. And, I remember one specific situation in Heaven where, this guy sort of just decided he was going to grab me because he wanted to sort of feel, do I live up to the stereotype that he imagined. And I think back to those moments, and I kind of dismissed it at the time. I didn't really think anything of it. It was months later that I realised, once I sort of pieced together all of those experiences, wow, this is shit. and decided that actually what I was experiencing wasn't about me personally. It absolutely was an experience that was being replicated across the community. And not long after, wanted to join Pride in London and a few other LGBT charities because just out of frustration, really.
When was your first Pride? Was your first Pride around the same time?
So my first Pride would have been a few years afterwards. And the first Pride that I actually ever volunteered at was in 2013. So the first time I actually experienced Pride was volunteering. I'd never been as a spectator. I'd never been part of the parade. And I mean, till this day, I still haven't actually gone as a spectator. And that was my first experience of Pride. And I met so many people who had mixed feelings for Pride. I had particularly LGBT black friends who would never be caught dead in an LGBT space, because of the issues that I alluded to earlier, and this kind of constant feeling of, and constantly being ostracized. And some of those people still, even till this day, would never go to a Pride event anywhere in the UK other than UK Black Pride. certainly wouldn't be, caught in any LGBT venue. And that's quite sad. But I was very quickly aware of those issues, learned a lot about those issues at my first Pride as well. And I, and quickly, all the frustration I'd felt before, it was just on the increase really. And I just felt, actually, how can I change something? And that was when I then decided to join Pride in London full time and work all year round.
How can we make LGBT venues, prides across the country, more of a space, more of a event that black people want to go to, trans people want to go to, bi people feel at home at? Alluding to Pride in London last year with the transphobic protest that put off a lot of people. Like, how do LGBT communities go from being gay, white, cis male focused and actually start to be held to account for,
I mean, first of all, we have to get to a position where the community even acknowledge and accept that those issues are prevalent within our community. Until those issues are accepted, it's almost impossible to work out actually what needs to be addressed, because it's so multi-layered and multifaceted. But I think it starts with acknowledging actually that these issues exist, that these issues and the experiences of people of colour and trans people are valid. And then it's actually really about, violently sounds it's probably the wrong word, but abruptly is the word I prefer, abruptly changing and dismantling the things that have, that uphold those things. And that might mean, deliberate moves to focus on and elevate people of colour and trans people. But a part of the whole process of saying that those experiences are valid and we need to accept that those things are issues is also recognising that just existing in some of these spaces is detrimental to people's well-being. It's a constant battle for some people because they don't feel safe. And once we accept that people don't feel safe, we can then start to build something and realise that actually, in order for us to make people feel safe, we have to ask those people, what is it? What would constitute a safe event for you? And then we build based on that.
I think it's the idea of yes, something might be called an LGBT safe space, but for a lot of LGBT people, it's not a safe space. Which also goes back to the idea of the flag. Yes, the rainbow flag represents the community, but not everyone resonates with that flag. It's that whole similar kind of idea. Yeah, just saying it's LGBT, saying it's safe space. Actually, when you look into it, a lot of times people of colour, trans people, don't feel safe in those spaces.
And what's really that's a nice lead on is that obviously it's 50 years of Stonewall since that whole revolution started. So in 50 years' time, where will we be?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question, because I answered it on an entirely separate podcast 2 weeks ago. The exact same question: where could we be in the next 50 years? And one of the things that I think is extraordinary about Pride movements is that actually, when we look back to 1969 what was the Stonewall riots, it wasn't the beginning of the Pride movement. It was what I would call a catalyst for Pride movements. And so we can look back on the last 50 years and we can look at the different things that the LGBT community have gained and won. But we can also look at actually the fact that there were so many things that weren't won, and also recognise why things were won in a certain order. So that the very fact that it's only just now that we're looking at the Gender Recognition Act, how many years after equal marriage, something that most people hadn't even realised was an issue for trans people in the UK. But not only that, but remembering that the people that we've ignored over that 50-year history it's not that they've suddenly come out of nowhere. These people and their voices and their experiences have been valid and present since the Stonewall riots. So for me, it's an acknowledgement that people of colour and trans people have been part of that struggle. So that would be what I'd hope for in 50 years, and that everyone understands that it's not this. It's not something that is some new phenomenon. The idea that the non-binary identity has just come out of nowhere. It hasn't. Those people have existed. We've chosen, and you say we, the LGBT community has chosen to ignore those identities, and that for me is problematic. But the other thing I'd hope for in the next 50 years is to be able to speak to really young people about some of the issues that we face today, and for them to almost laugh in my face because they can't possibly believe that someone would be as ridiculous as to dismiss people's experiences in the way that they maybe do now. I don't think we'll eradicate the issues that we have, bearing in mind it's a global fight and some countries aren't even afforded same-sex relationships, let alone same-sex marriage. But I do hope that we're in a position where in certain parts of the world children almost laugh because they just can't possibly believe someone was ever that ridiculous. Because one of the things that I think we forget to talk about is this idea that actually the pushback for LGBT rights isn't logical in every sense of the way, and I don't think we talk about that enough. The fact that it doesn't actually make sense, and for me, that's what I hope for.
And pushback in what way? The pushback from other people or pushback from within the LGBT community?
The pushback from the cis community, the pushback from straight people who believe that this is an affront on their rights, instead of actually about it actually being about empowering people who have been disenfranchised from so many things.
There's a great quote, and this is where I wear a literary head from E.M. Foster, where he is talking about his book Maurice, and he says that the issue with homosexuality isn't the act itself, it's the thought or having to think about it. And is that the kind of thing that you're on about, people having to consciously tackle these issues head on, rather than just brush them under the rug and pretend that everything's fine?
Absolutely, but I think one of the things that some activists have almost pretended, for rightly or wrongly, is that in order for us to move forward, some people, in fact everyone, will feel uncomfortable, because one of the things that underpins so many of the issues that we face, whether that's sexism or racism, is this idea that is all underpinned by a social construct that people sign up to. They haven't realised they signed up to it, but as we're in a position where people have signed up to it and that's what they're comfortable with and that's what they, it's what they've learned and it's what they expect. And until we dismantle that idea that the way that we live our lives is set and can't be altered in any way, we'll always come up against people who will, who will feel that what we're doing is unnecessary.
And I don't think feeling uncomfortable, going back to when you were just saying about that, is a bad thing. I think as well it's about acknowledging why you feel uncomfortable and being aware that actually there's a reason why you feel uncomfortable and acting upon that. Because I guess I feel uncomfortable because someone's told me this. Why do I feel uncomfortable? And then researching into it, looking into it. It's not that hard.
But why do I feel uncomfortable? But also, I might feel uncomfortable in the 2 minutes I've had to listen to a lecture from someone who's told me what I said was racist. But actually, how does that compare to the systematic racism that the person who's having to do the lecture has faced for the entirety of their life? And that, for me, it's all about perspective. It's this understanding that actually the small amount of uncomfortableness that you're feeling in this specific situation isn't comparable to the many situations that person might have faced just that day, let alone in a week, a month, a year since they dropped out of their mum's womb, and that for me is also important.
A few times it's been brought up about social media and using social media to express opinions, or sometimes being not the right person to be speaking. Is social media for Western culture the place for activism, or do you think there's more people should be doing, or do you think it should be taken away from social media and actually, like you were saying, people all talk on social media and be like about issues, but whether they're putting that into practice or not is something different. So
there's a place for social media in activism, but one of the things that I think I always stress is that social media should be there to complement and to social media should be there to complement and to almost go alongside things that you're doing in practice. Otherwise, it's pointless, and I mean that in every sense anyway. Not even just in terms of activism. What's the point in tweeting if you're not doing it? If you were just sat in bed all day every day, you wouldn't have much to tweet about. And it's the same thing actually. It's easy to send out a tweet. Really, it's quite easy to send out a tweet. It's harder to acknowledge maybe what your friend is doing or what you're doing. That's problematic.
From the last week, my mum listened in, and even small things like correcting my mum on her use of pronouns when she's referring to specific people, even challenging that was a little bit uncomfortable for me personally, because I've never had to do that with someone before. But actually that 2 seconds that I had to do that actually cannot compare to anyone else's experience of being misgendered.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I'm really proud of my mum. I feel she's come on this journey with me, but without me pushing her to in any way, shape or form. And I won't say my mum's age because she'd probably kill me, but she's certainly, not getting younger, shall we say, and of a different generation. And so, I think people almost have this expectation that because people are from an older generation, it almost excuses or means we should kind of ignore certain behaviours. And one of the proudest moments I've ever had with my mum was just her acknowledging someone's pronouns after I'd corrected her, without any, without much fuss. And she probably didn't really think it meant much. She probably thought it meant absolutely nothing. But for me, it was a really powerful moment. And that's that's something that's actually quite sad in itself. The fact that I was overwhelmed with joy that someone just used the correct pronouns for somebody, that's really sad. But it's something that I think is a part of that journey. You're going to have moments where you experience something that makes you think, wow, okay, we're moving forward. Some people are moving forward, and because sometimes activism can be quite draining. It's like you feel like you're repeating yourself. I remember I went to an event last year, which was the launch of the BME LGBT charity, and one of the things I spoke about was this idea that I could copy and paste some of the things that I'd written for a whole host of publications, 6-7 years ago, and they still ring true today, and that's really frustrating. And so sometimes those small wins, when you have had to challenge somebody and maybe you feel slightly uncomfortable in yourself, are what actually make you think, actually, okay, this is worth it. We are moving forward, even though sometimes it's, you feel like you might hit your head against the table.
But also, I suppose they're then those moments that you realise just how far we still have to go. So, yes, it's reflective and you can kind of perhaps have a mini celebration that something has changed, but also, why am I still having to have this conversation? Why are we still having to be at this point?
Yeah, I stopped asking myself why were we still having these conversations. In the last 2 years, I've been trying to stop myself from asking myself that question, because I think to do that dismisses the how robust the structures that we're working within are. They're designed and built by people who want them to stay in those ways. And for me, once you acknowledge that, then you realise actually what it is that's ahead. To change society, is no small task. And I think once you start to acknowledge that, you stop asking yourself. Sometimes I get frustrated when people quote tweet really problematic things and they say, "Wow, are we still seeing this in 2019?" And I'm like, actually, yeah, we are, because what we're up against is not just unconscious issues. They're people who are deliberately doing things to, to go up against equality and what should be the right thing.
One thing I want to ask quickly, kind of changing the subject slightly, but going back to you as an activist, especially someone who's quite outspoken on people of colour and the issues people of colour face, do you ever get tired of answering the same questions over again when a lot of this information is accessibly out there? Like, a lot of the stuff is, do a Google search or just look on social media at this person's tweet and see the racism. Like, do you ever get annoyed of having to constantly educate people on things that they, should already know?
I definitely do get frustrated at times, but I think one of the things I learned most in 2017 and 2018 is that there are so many amazing activists who are up against the same thing, and I've really learned to laugh with some of those people about the things that we face, not because they're funny in any way, shape, or form, but in order to almost keep sane, to
laugh or cry.
Laugh or cry, exactly, and sometimes both. But yeah, for me, it's, it's kind of, I don't know, putting that in a box and just thinking, well, actually, I wasn't naive when I started getting involved in Pride in London. I didn't think that the world was going to be changed overnight. And I think it is slightly naive to believe that you're not going to have to repeat yourself. Again, as I say, referring back to what I said before, when we know what we're up against, we know that we're up against people who don't want things to change because it affects their own status, which for some people isn't earned. It's something that they've got through a structure that they already existed within, whether that's hereditary or whether that's just the people that they had access to because of their education or their friendship circles. And for me, once you acknowledge that, you can be at ease with the idea that actually you're going to have to repeat yourself over and over again. You're going to have to answer the same questions. But I don't in any way feel upset by people who decide that they don't want to answer those questions. Google is free is quite often the response kind of is flippant, and I like it. It's not my style, unless you're really irritating me. But I completely accept that people have the right to also say, I don't. It's not my job to educate you, and I accept that some people will take that stance, and I don't think any little of them. I just believe that somebody has to do the work, and somebody has to be out there and advocate in some way. Otherwise, it's that we get to a standstill, and it takes people shouting from the outside. But it also takes someone being on the inside somewhere and listening and acknowledging and doing something with that.
Well, I think that draws to an end of what we had to say. So thank you, Rhammel, for being on the podcast this week.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for actually everything you had to say.
So I hope you found that was an interesting conversation with Rhammel. Some interesting points about being black, being bi, coming to Soho and finding that kind of culture.
Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. We delved into a lot of different things, and we all both had a lot of interesting questions that it's good to get a different perspective on, a perspective that neither of us have as two white people. So it's good to see things from a different perspectives.
So I think from us that's it.
Yeah, that is it for this week's episode.
So see you on the flip side.
I can't with that.